The 1950s are a complicated period in U.S. history. In these images here, you can see some of the contradictions, with happy nuclear families living in the suburbs. Of course, some of those same families also attended pro-segregation rallies and held signs that said, "Race mixing is communism." So I hope you'll be able to make sense of these competing narratives of the era. The GI Bill offered important opportunities for American veterans, including low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans, and tuition and living expenses. In the peak year of 1947, veterans accounted for 49% of college admissions. Millions also took advantage of the GI Bill's home loan guarantee. Think about what the post-war period was like for World War I veterans and contrast that with World War II. Think about the bonus army, how they were so desperate to just get this small bonus, and all of these new options and this extended safety net extended to veterans in the post-war period, and how much it changed their lives. I'm sure for many of us, we have felt the impacts of the GI Bill. For example, my grandfather had come from generations of coal miners in West Virginia. He was a pilot during World War II. Afterwards, he was able to return to West Virginia, and he went to college and he became an engineer. And all 5 of his children were then able to also go to college. And so you can see the long-term generational benefits from this that sort of began during this period. The United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful and wealthiest country in the world. It is sometimes thought of as the golden age of capitalism, with economic expansion, stable prices, low unemployment, and rising standards of living. This chart here is really important. It shows the income distribution for the wealthiest 10%. You can see that the top 10% have always had a lot, but what do you notice about the income inequality of the early 20th century? Remember how I said the 1920s was something as a second Gilded Age? And then you'll notice what happens in the middle of the 20th century. This post-war moment, the combination of New Deal policies and union membership, GI Bill benefits, and the post-war economy narrowed the gap between the rich and poor and created the first real middle class. Of course, you can see what happens starting in the 1970s as the middle class begins to shrink. This meant that white middle-class Americans had enough income to afford a home, a car or two, and many newly invented appliances. By 1956, there were more white-collar than blue-collar workers in the United States. And by 1960, 60% of Americans were in the middle class. However, at the same time, over 20% of Americans still lived below the poverty line. So it's important to sort of see that everyone wasn't thriving in this moment. There were limitations to this American dream. Think about the women who had worked in the defense industries during World War II. How their lives changed radically in just a few years. For one, many middle-class women felt trapped in this new role, isolated in the suburbs with no one to interact with but children. Also, look at these advertisements. What do they point to? What were women supposed to be concerned about? They're borderline here, just shown to be obsessed with household appliances, vacuums and washing machines and detergent and ketchup bottles that even they can open. So, they don't necessarily reflect reality, but show this sort of ideal. And of course, women had always been responsible for the household labor, but this looks a little bit different, that it shows it to be their something that they find a lot of joy in, which is not really how I feel about vacuuming and washing my clothes and doing those kinds of chores. But so here we can see that popular culture presents women's main goals as marriage, family, and homemaking. They were seen as the mother and wife almost exclusively. The ideal family was suburban, with a father with a career and a mother who didn't work outside the home. Unsurprisingly, this image was inaccurate. While there was a drop in female employment after the war, by 1955, more women worked than had during World War II. Women's employment concentrated in non-union work with few opportunities, so clerical, sales, and service industries, and they earned about 60% of men's wages. The million African American veterans of World War II received far fewer benefits from the GI Bill. They were not allowed admission into the vast majority of America's still white-only universities. Similarly, the cheap loans used to build millions and millions of new homes in suburbs were of little benefit for African Americans, who were banned from these suburbs through a variety of practices, including restrictive covenants. Here you can see a few examples. A covenant is a legally enforceable contract imposed in a deed upon the buyer of a property. This practice was so widespread that by 1940, 80% of property in Chicago and Los Angeles and other cities carried restrictive covenants barring black families. So this practice was taking place all over the country, not just in the Deep South. Of course, as you can see in Crisis in Levittown this week, there were other ways to make it unpleasant for black families to move to the suburbs. So the 1950s really has a lot of conflicting legacies. For some, the period represents middle-class affluence. But if you'll remember what we talked about last week, it was also a period of political witch hunts and the constant fear of the end of the world. But it was also the beginning of one of the biggest social rebellions in U.S. history.